Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, at American Institutes for Research. The Center on KTDRR is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, known as NIDILRR, in the U.S. Department of Education, Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Community Living. I'm Joanne Starks with the Austin office of American Institutes for Research, or AIR. I also want to thank my colleagues Shoshana Rabanowski and Donna Matrani, who are helping with the logistics today. Today's webcast, KT101, an Introduction to Knowledge Translation, or How to Become Impactastic, serves as a pre-conference session ahead of next week's 2018 online KT conference. The session will provide an overview of basic information about knowledge translation for participants who are new to the field and a review for those with more experience. The presentation will focus on practices that help move research to impact. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. David Phipps is Executive Director of Research and Innovation Services at York University in Toronto, Canada, where he manages all research grants and agreements, including knowledge translation and technology transfer for York University. He has received numerous honors and awards, including the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for his work in knowledge mobilization, and has been named the most influential knowledge mobilizer in Canada. He is the KT lead for the Kids Brain Health Network and is Network Director for Research Impact Canada, a network of 11 Canadian universities. So let's get started. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will address them as we can. I will now hand things over to you, David. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shoshana and Joanne, for the introductions and the invitation to do this. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you find yourself today. If you find yourself in North America, I hope that you don't have too much Halloween candy hangover from Halloween last night. Thank you also to everyone who completed the information survey that was sent out previously. I wanted to get a sense of who you are and the experience that you have, and we're a very diverse group. We've got some people who have less than 1 year of experience and some people who have more than 20 years of experience in fields related to KT and knowledge translation and research impact. Some of you have had no training, some of you have taken some courses, some have had informal capacity development. Many of you have engaged in dissemination activities, some have done some stakeholder engagement and some collaborative research, and fewer have been involved in impact assessment. So, and none of that is surprising to me. So thank you very much, because that provides a little bit of background. And also, for those who are new, feel free to ask questions. For those who have got experience in the field, feel free to share your expertise as well. But I'm going to start off with land acknowledgement. That York University acknowledges our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And we do this in Canada as part of our efforts for truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous individuals. So I encourage you, wherever you are, if you are in North America or other places that have an Indigenous communities, to think about the land that you're on and how we relate to those who have come before us and who are still with us today. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so about impact, about knowledge translation, and feel free to put some questions into the chat box, and if they're urgent, Joanne and or Shoshana will interrupt me, and if not, then we will gather those towards the end. So this is an example of impact, in my opinion. This is an example from the University of Saskatchewan, and the picture there is a picture of pulse crops. These are lentils and peas, and they're useful for crop rotation during when Canada had the wheat glut. And Professor Al Skinnard of the University of Saskatchewan collaborated with Agriculture Canada and local farmers to develop these crops. this now has created a global market of $4.2 billion a year. I think we can safely say that that is an impact coming out of this research. But what's important in this research that I'd like to point out is that he collaborated with Agriculture Canada and local farmers. He worked with the stakeholders. He didn't just do his excellent research within the university, but worked with government and farmer and user stakeholders to be able to develop this, because we can't make impact on its own. Here's a story, and my question, is this impact? So this is a story of a $2 million gift from music education research that came to York University. A few years ago, we were contacted by the Regents Park School of Music, and this is a community-based school of music who contacted us, and by us I mean our knowledge mobilization unit, and I'll talk about mobilization versus translation in a moment. And they called the knowledge mobilization unit because at York University, our knowledge mobilization unit serves, one of our purposes is to create these connections between researchers and students and their non-academic partners, and we serve as a place to say, if you've ever wanted to talk to a researcher, give us a call. We try and find the right researcher to meet your needs. So a lot of our work is actually demand-driven or user pull. And so they reached out to us, and they were looking for a research capacity to help understand their community, understand the role of music in community. And the fellow who is in forefront in the picture holding this triangle is Alan Carswell. He got hold of this opportunity. He's a graduate of York. He started up a couple companies. He's a longtime donor to York. And his wife is very connected to community-based music. And so there was a $2 million gift that came to the university that funded a research chair in community-based research for music. And out of that, we're also funding community campus collaborations, all of which have a knowledge mobilization element. So I would say this is an impact as we think about it. It's certainly impact to our bottom line and to our external research income, but this is certainly knowledge translation. And we hope out of the projects that we have funded that some impacts may arise. So this is the first of the polls. There will be polls throughout this. I invite you to vote on the polls, and then we can engage with a little bit of dialogue in the chat box. And my question is, you see that there's knowledge mobilization twice. One of those is supposed to be knowledge translation, but I think we've corrected that on the poll. And so Shoshana, could you please open up the first poll? And everyone, when that poll is open, yes, knowledge translation is there. Thank you for that correction. Please vote to see what terms do you use routinely in your practice. Okay, perfect. Thank you. We've still got a couple votes coming in, but clearly we can see that knowledge translation is the dominant. Thank you, Sashan. If you could close that poll, but keep if it's possible, to keep it open so we can see it. That knowledge translation is a dominant term that is used. Interestingly, very few in knowledge mobilization. In Canada, knowledge mobilization is a term that is used by our Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So a lot of social scientists and humanists use the term knowledge mobilization. Knowledge translation is the term used by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So most of our health scientists are using knowledge translation. And then knowledge exchange is a term that in Canada has been used, knowledge transfer and exchange, by the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation, which is now called the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement. And impact. Some people are using the term impact. So thank you very much for that. I noticed nobody uses other, and nobody uses extension. I had expected that if this was an agricultural audience, or especially an audience in African countries, the word extension is often used, especially in land-grant universities that were founded in the U.S. in the late 1800s, that were founded on this principle of extension, that the public money should go to invest in agricultural research that then is shared, is extended into the local farming industry and farming communities. So thank you very much, Shoshana. If you could please close those polls. So thank you for that. And this is, so my point of this slide is there's lots of terms, and I don't care what you use. I've got into some lively discussions with some people who feel it's important to point out the difference between translation and transfer, and I can appreciate those differences, but for my purpose as a practitioner, I'm just busy getting the job done. I happen to use the word mobilization because one of our first funders was the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and as I pointed out just now, that mobilization is their words. So we run a knowledge mobilization unit because our first funders were SSHRC, and we aligned with their words. If we had been funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, I have no doubt I would be running a knowledge translation unit, not a knowledge mobilization unit. So my encouragement is to not get hung up into what I call definitional dystopia. You know, just let's use, I respect the words that you use, and let's just move on to doing the good work. I will just take a moment and say the top word, engaged scholarship, is an important word for what we do, because as we will talk about in this webinar, engagement is a necessary precursor to impact. And our researchers, especially those in the social sciences and humanities, while they use knowledge mobilization because it's the term of their funder, they consider themselves as engaged scholars. Scholars who are engaged in their research with organizations beyond the academy. So, and I also want to suggest that when you do this is more important than what you call it. So in Canada, we talk about integrated knowledge translation and end-of-grant knowledge translation. Integrated knowledge translation happens throughout the process. It happens as collaborative research or co-produced research, and end-of-grant is the dissemination types of research. What I've written there is that dissemination is necessary but not sufficient to inform change. This is work that's come out of Sandra Nutley from the Research Unit for Research Utilization at St. Andrews University, and recognizing that getting your work out there is necessary. We have to do that. We can't inform decisions beyond the academy if the research only stays within the academy, but sending your information to people is a less efficient way of creating the conditions for impact than if you work with them, if you engage stakeholders early and often, and you work with key partners along the way. So the message here is that we really need to focus on mixed methods. I work in the research office at York University, so a big part of our work in supporting impact comes in supporting impact strategies and grant applications. In Canada, as I've mentioned, these are knowledge mobilization strategies if you're applying to SSHRC, and these are knowledge translation strategies if you're applying to Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and they're commercialization strategies if you're applying to the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council or the STEM funder. And so we work a lot on grant applications, and what I see mostly coming in is dissemination strategies. I see grant applicants focusing on, I'm going to finish my research and then I'm going to send it out, and bless their hearts, they often say, I'm going to have a website, period. And you know, that's nice, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So what we'll be talking about today, and I encourage you to think about your own practice, is how are you disseminating, but going beyond dissemination to engage with your stakeholders early and to collaborate with key partners along the way. Again, feel free if you have questions to type those into the chat box. So our second poll is going to be talking about what KT methods have you used or do you hope to use. I asked this in the survey that was sent out previously, so I've got a sense of what this audience might be looking at. But Shoshana, if you could please open up this poll, and everyone, click as many as you want of all of these different types of KT methods. There's a lot of choices, so I'm going to give it a little while as people read through the list. And lots of people are using lots of different KT methods. Few votes still coming in. You know, we need a countdown clock. We need a theme song like Jeopardy, you know, so that we know how long we're going to have. But that's really good. Thank you very much for that. Shoshana, if you could end the poll but keep the results up. And so we see an awful lot of academic publishing, dissemination. I really like that workshops is way up there because I'm a big fan of workshops. One thing that I'll talk about it right now, is remember that dissemination is necessary but not sufficient. We know from the Paris framework, it's an older model, but it's a PARIHS, Promoting Action, Research, and Implementation in Health Services. I think that's the acronym. And that work instructed us that if we want our evidence to be used in practice or taken up and used in practice, we need to pay attention to three things. The evidence itself. So what is the rigorous, what's the robustness, who's the leader around that evidence? What is the context of the use? Because how you use evidence in an indigenous community is going to be different than how industry uses evidence. And then the facilitation is the third element. So how you facilitate in an indigenous community is going to be different than how you facilitate evidence uptake in an industrial setting. And so I like to say, and if you've got your pens on hand right now, write this down, and maybe if someone, if Joanna or Shoshana are monitoring the chat box, if you could type this in the chat box, that you need to facilitate the uptake of evidence in the context of its use. So facilitate the uptake of evidence in the context of its use. And this is really important, as we'll get to in a minute, because it's not good enough just to disseminate your evidence. You have to go to where it's being used and facilitate the uptake of that evidence. And by facilitate, I mean workshops. So I've expounded a lot on workshops just because I feel that they're a very useful mechanism for facilitating research uptake. So you go to the industrial setting, you go to the health clinic where these practices are going to be used, and then give a workshop with those who might be taking up that evidence and using it. And preferably, if you're giving a workshop, have it co-hosted by a partner who's been along with you in this research evidence. So that's my long rant about supporting a workshop. And thank you, Joanne, for facilitating the uptake of evidence in the context of its use. So I also like to come to stakeholder engagement. There is 72% who do stakeholder engagement. Absolutely fundamental. I tell the story of the Rick Hansen Institute in Canada, and if anyone from Rick Hansen Institute is on the line, please give a shout out in the chat box. But Rick Hansen, for those who don't know, is a man who is living with a spinal cord injury. He was an athlete. He is in a wheelchair. He wheeled around the world, literally, in the latter part, I'm going to say the 1980s or 1990s. And he raised awareness and raised funds for spinal cord injury research and came back to Canada. And when he started up the Rick Hansen Institute, the first thing he did was talk to stakeholders. And he talked to clinicians and scientists who said to him, our priorities are biomarkers and neuroimaging. And when he talked to people who were living with spinal cord injury and their families, they said our most important things are erectile dysfunction and bladder control. So if you only talk to the air quotes experts, like the clinicians and the scientists, you're only going to get one part of the picture. It's not that we shouldn't do biomarkers and neuroimaging. Absolutely we should. But we should also be looking at erectile dysfunction and bladder control. So this is my support for stakeholder engagement, is you need to talk to your stakeholders not only at the beginning to inform your research, but engage them as you go along. So thank you very much. Shoshana, if you could please close that poll and we will proceed. So I'm going to, in the rest of the talk about the who, what, and the how of impact. I mean, I talked a little bit about the when just previously, but we're really going to focus on who, what, and how of impact of research. So this is my cat, Gogo. Now, if you were all in a room with me, you'd be going, aw, isn't she cute? So I all want you to think in your heads, aw. And if someone wants to chat, aw, that would be really nice too. And so this is my cat Gogo, and she's having a nap on using evidence. This is a book. I mentioned Sandra Nutley previously. Thank you, Laura. She is cute. And Sandra Nutley has just recently retired from running the research unit for research utilization. I have that as the web link on this slide. At the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, they have a research unit that looks at how research evidence is used, mainly in social services and public policy. And she has recently retired from the research unit for research utilization, but her co-author on this book, Hugh Davies, is now running the center. Very active, a lot of scholarship in this space. And this is the point of my slide, is to say there's a lot of evidence about evidence use, that the work that I do, the work that you do, is based on there is an evidence base for this. So I encourage you to become familiar with that evidence base, especially if you're supporting evidence use. You can be able to talk about theoretical frameworks and understand the scholarship that underpins your practice. Or if you are a scholar, you're probably contributing to this evidence base, as practitioners do as well. One thing that I link to is this Knowledge Mobilization Journal Club, and again, these links will all be on the slides that will be available to you. I take, for the last, 5 years or something, I've done a monthly Knowledge Mobilization Journal Club. It's online, and I take an article that I've read, a peer-reviewed, usually peer-reviewed, sometimes there's some reports in there, an article that I think is interesting, and I reflect upon it from a practitioner's perspective, because that's the role I play at the university. I am an impact practitioner or a KT practitioner. And so I wanted to make an effort to try and bridge the gap between what we know in scholarship and what we do in practice. So all this to say is that there is an evidence base to the work that we do. And I'll just let you pause on this. So for the Canadians in the room, these are different impact frameworks. And my comment at the bottom is, do we really need another one? Like, seriously. For the Canadians in the room, you will recognize the top in the middle as being the knowledge to action cycle. This is a cycle that has been made quite popular because it was the cycle adopted by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. On the right, on the lower left is the payback model. That is an early model that was modeling a framework, conceptual framework for impact, and that underpins the one in the top right, which is the impact assessment framework for the Alberta Innovates program. It used to be Innovate Health Solutions, and now it's the Alberta Provincial Funder. I saw someone from Calgary on the line, so you're probably quite familiar with this. And the one on the lower right has come out very recently in August, and this is from a group of Canadian Association of Health Services and Policy Research, I think it is. And they've taken the one above and they've added some arrows to it to address some ongoing stakeholder engagement. The one on the top left, I'm not even going to talk about. There is a cone of possibilities and acceptable outcome space. Sigh, right? So I don't even know what that means. Yes, payback model on the lower left. Thank you, Joanne. She's typing. Knowledge to action. The Alberta model on the top right, and the Canadian Association of Health Services and Policy Research is the lower right. So I was invited in 2012 to be part of a committee to advise the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council on evaluating their knowledge mobilization and impact funding programs. And they're evaluators, so the first thing they did was say to me, David, how can we make sense of any of these frameworks? I guess if it doesn't start and it doesn't stop, how do we get a beginning and an end? So could you please create a model that we can actually work with? And so that's where I came up with this. A model that describes campus and community, air quotes community, because air quotes community means it's anyone who's not on campus. It could be industry, government, nonprofits, educational institutions, indigenous communities, people with lived experience, faith groups, so that's the air quotes community. And knowledge mobilization is a function, it's a set of services, it's a set of practices that just help bring community and campus together into shared spaces. Some of those shared spaces might be ones of knowledge transfer where I have something and I give it to you. Some of those spaces might be knowledge exchange, where I give you something, you give me something, but we're really not working together. And some of those spaces might be areas of co-production or collaboration. And sometimes when we bring community and campus into these shared spaces, then impact can arise. And so my simple model of knowledge mobilization is that it helps make research useful to society by supporting engaged scholarship from inception to impact. And so you remember I said earlier when we were looking at methods, the engagement of the engaged scholarship or the stakeholder engagement throughout from inception to impact, I feel is a key to maximizing the potential to have an impact on this work. So this is my straightforward model. What this does is this sets up a logic between knowledge mobilization, which is how we want to do something, and the impact that occurs, or it's what we're trying to accomplish. And so this means that if, for the evaluators on the call, if there are any of you, you will realize that that impact is the dependent variable. It's the thing we measure. And that knowledge mobilization becomes, or in health words, knowledge translation, becomes the independent variable. It's the things that we change, the things that we do, to be able to observe an effect on the dependent variable or impact. And so this creates really two sides of the same coin, in that impact planning is a strategy and it's a how we do something, and impact assessment understands what we do. And really the two of them go very tightly together, that if we are doing impact planning, we by default must also therefore be doing planning ex ante impact assessment, because we have to plan in the indicators and how we're going to assess right from the beginning. And so this further allows us to create a logic. If we think of a logic model, and hopefully many of you have heard of a logic model, which really says we do activities, and those activities have outputs, and those outputs have outcomes, and those outcomes ultimately have impacts. Some logic models don't use the word impact, they use short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, but I use the word impact because it's important to the language of the work that we're doing right now. And so if we layer research language under that logic model, then we do co-produced research. Now I'll talk about the dotted line in a minute. But the activity after that research is dissemination. Remember I said dissemination is necessary but not sufficient? So we must disseminate the research. And then somebody takes that research up. They take up that research and they evaluate it. They say if it's any good, then they move on and they implement that into their policies, practices, and services. And it's those policies, practices, and services that have an impact on the lives of end users. And so critically important in this model right now is there's two things. One is this moment between dissemination and uptake. There is a moment where the research evidence leaves the researcher and is taken up in a practice or policy setting. And I'll come to why that's important. And this dotted line is interesting. Many of you might have heard of the issue of attribution. And the issue of attribution is how much of the impact that we observe can we attribute to the research evidence that was produced? Because we know all sorts of other things go in along the way other than the research evidence to be able to create that impact. So many funders are interested in being, especially donors to international development, to say our dollars created had this percentage of effect on that impact. So I was thinking about impact, and there's a scholar at the King's College London, Annette Boaz. I'm going to type her name in if you're interested, Annette Boaz. Annette Boaz is at King's College London, and a number of years ago she wrote a paper or a report on attribution. And so I was reading this because in my practice, which as I've mentioned is about knowledge brokering and co-production, I really don't see attribution as an issue. Because when we're tracking an impact, one of the questions I always ask is, would this have happened if not for the research? And they said, absolutely not. And so what she wrote was two interesting sentences in her report, that your method of knowledge translation may affect the issue of attribution. For example, she said, in co-production or collaboration, you can sometimes have an impact even before you finish the project. You can have an impact on the awareness and the beliefs and the attitudes of the project participants, not the subjects, but the researchers and the collaborators. So you can actually have an impact on raised awareness even before the project is finished. So that's the dotted arrow. And while that impact might not be the policy impact you're seeking, raised awareness is a very important impact, and it's a necessary precursor to be able to for research use. Thank you very much, Joanne Starks, who's doing an awesome job at Googling all of what comes out of my mouth. So remember that I said to you that the evaluators wanted a nice simple diagram to be able to evaluate and to be understand knowledge translation and impact, and all the other ones had double-headed arrows and circles, and it never stopped and never ended. Well, this is that version because I look at this version, and what you will mainly see, and your critique should be right away, is too linear. And we know that no individual instance of knowledge mobilization or knowledge translation is linear, that it goes forward and backwards and around and into unexpected places. So I put everything to be double-headed arrows, to be circles, and to have things that go from the back to the front. And I call this the Coproduced Pathway to Impact, which we co-developed with PrevNet on the top left there, a network in Canada that is doing research and implementation into bullying prevention. And we call this the Co-Produced Pathway to Impact. You'll see that the essential elements of research, dissemination, uptake, implementation, and impact are the same from the previous slide. But what this has done is recognize that academic researchers and their co-production partners have opportunities to collaborate all the way along the pathway. And so we recognize that academic researchers and co-production partners still operate in their own spaces, but there's a shared space in the middle of collaboration for collaborative research, dissemination to academic and non-academic partners, how an academic research can help facilitate the uptake of evidence in the context of its use, thank you, the Paris Framework, and how we can help implement the evidence into policies, or help our partners implement the policies, research evidence into policies, practices, and services. Here's an interesting thing. See the impact line? That comes out of our co-production partner space. And this is absolutely important because I say to my researchers, you, and I point at them, don't make any impact. And of course, gasp and feelings of mistrust. And I say, no, you publish your papers, you graduate your students, you do all that important work, but you don't make products. Industry does. And you don't develop public policy. Government does. And you generally don't deliver social services. Community does. So if you want your research to have an impact on the lives of end users, then you need to be working in collaboration with people who can take up those research results and implement them into policies, practices, and services. And wait, you will say, or your researchers will say, my research is in the classroom. I'm helping kids. My research is in the clinic. I'm a nursing researcher. I'm helping my patients. And absolutely you are. But you're having a benefit on the people, the subjects of your research, but they are subjects of your research. If you do a randomized controlled trial, the patients who are benefiting that are a research outcome. They are not yet an impact. The impact occurs when that randomized controlled trial is moved into a clinical practice guideline, and that becomes part of continuing medical education, and the change in practice is evaluated, it's scaled through in Canada through a health network, through a province, and that's the impact. So research that is done in a practical setting, like in social work, like in nursing, in education, in health clinical practice, absolutely you can be having benefits on your patients, but that's not the impact that we're talking about. The other piece that's here is the bottom line has been turned into stakeholder engagement. So it's important. We often talk about talking to end users and bringing their perspectives upstream into the research so we can do research like Rick Hansen did. However, what's also important, what this diagram does by showing we can co-produce up to implementation, is yes, we need to bring the stakeholders, the end users upstream, but we also need to bring the researchers downstream. Right? We have a tendency of doing a handoff at dissemination, washing our hands of it and saying, we being the academy, and saying move on. But this diagram encourages us to stay with that evidence, to facilitate the uptake of evidence in the context of its use, and to work and help our partners implement that into policies, practices, and services. And we published that, the references in the red bar at the bottom. And in Canada, in addition to PrevNet, there's a number of large-scale networks of research and implementation networks that have adopted this pathway. And this is an important thing because we don't expect any single research project to go all the way to impact. And if it does, it's not in a linear fashion like this. This is a model that is being being adopted by systems of research or networks of research. And that's because if you're looking at a portfolio of research, you can actually use this pathway to monitor your projects and monitor which ones are moving forward beyond dissemination to uptake to implementation and ultimately to impact. And it's not that every research project has to go to impact, but in a portfolio, things must move. And therefore, in a portfolio approach, linear is okay. And that's a paradigm, oh my God, because we've always said linear is wrong. But in this instance, when you're looking at, and linear is wrong for any single project, but when you're looking at a portfolio of research, linear is okay because your portfolio does move. Again, feel free to put any questions into the chat box. And so here, I'm going to show you this example, illustrate this as an example from Kids Brain Health Network, which is a research and implementation network in neurodevelopmental disorders, so autism, cerebral palsy, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And this is a story of social ABCs. I'll tell you what that is in a second. One thing that we did was we talked to our stakeholders. We talked to parents of kids. We talked to kids that have grown up and are self-advocates. We talked to educators, clinicians, researchers, and policymakers, and allied health professionals. And we identified 44 needs that our stakeholders told us about. And of course, we can't do 44 things, and of course, 44 things are not within the mandate of Kids Brain Health Network. But we identified the top 6 needs that are within the mandate of Kids Brain Health Network. The number one need by far was that parents needed, the parents identified for us, was they want specialized training for educators. Because my kid is spending 8 hours in an educational setting, I need the teacher to understand what autism is. I need the teacher to understand how to work with someone with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. The second priority was the treatment. They wanted treatment for the child as soon as possible. Oftentimes, diagnosis is delayed until 4, 5, or 6 years old. And that's missing a critical time for the opportunity for interventions. And thank you, Joanne, for putting that in. And among the top 6, need number 9 was the more resources and the more efficient use of resources. So given that, these needs helped underpin the work of Social ABCs, which was a research program that recognized very early on social and developmental delays. And it created an intervention where in this case, early childhood educators, and I should say there's an error on this slide, and the error is mine. It's not Sick Kids Hospital, it's Bloorview Kids Rehab is the hospital that did this work. Researchers at the hospital with early childhood educator practitioners, so you can see that under the co-produced research. The Ministry of Community and Youth Services, Child and Youth Services funded this research to scale it through other communities, and it works with the children to get their attention and to reward their attention. So this dissemination, the researchers did their peer-reviewed publications, they presented at conferences, but they also went to family events. They also went to places where families were hanging out, and what we did as part of the KT Core was we developed a parent manual. So there was a technical manual for the early childhood educators, and we helped turn that into a parent manual because the researchers wanted to deploy this in the home as well as in the educational setting. And so researchers trained the early childhood educators. This is the uptake. The early childhood educators took up the research evidence and they trained the parents. And so they implemented that not just in community settings, but also at home. And then the Ministry of Child and Youth Services funded it to make a publicly available intervention across Ontario. It's not all across Ontario, but it's in a number of clinics in Ontario right now. And the impact of this is a link that I'm not going to play right now because it's to a video, but I would encourage you to click on this link. It's a news story published by Global News about Kids' Brain Health Network's social ABCs, and it tells the story of this child, Alex. And Alex is 6 years old, but when he was born, he was showing developmental delays early, and his doctor said he was going to be nonverbal his whole life. And so he got the social ABCs, and now he is chatty. That's one of the things that says Alex is now 6 years old and chatty. And you hear Alex chatting away. You hear Alex talking with his mother and interacting with his mother in ways that he never could do before. And his mother explains that this was like a lifeline that she threw in and could bring Alex out of his locked-in nonverbal state. And she has this lovely comment of, she said, Alex said, "I love you, Mommy," for the first time during this program. And so there's an example of impact, and its impact, Alex, is one of many stories like this. So that's, I encourage you to click on that link once you get the slides, and you'll be able to see this story of social ABCs. So that illustrates, for one story, that's gone from stakeholder engaged research all the way through to implementation and impact. So what have we done with this pathway at York University, in Kids Brain Health Network, and in Research Impact Canada? We've taken the pathway and we've developed tools. So it's important as you're thinking about your own practice to be, so first off, a conceptual pathway is nice, but it's just a conceptual pathway. How you do a research to impact pathway, and I did this, use these examples recently for a global health grant program, how you're going to, your impact pathway and how you go, the indicators you use if you're developing access to epilepsy services in sub-Saharan Africa is going to be different than how your impact pathway if you're developing a microarray to detect genetic variations of Epstein-Barr virus-induced lymphomas in Malaysia. Right? So the conceptual pathway is just the conceptual pathway. You need the work that you need to do, and you need to encourage your other impact practitioners to do, is to adapt this pathway. Many people in Canada know the Knowledge to Action Framework, and there was, or Knowledge to Action Cycle, and there was a systematic review of papers that were used that cited the Knowledge to Action Cycle as their conceptual framework, and of 146 articles reviewed, only 10 bothered to implement it. They just said, that's our conceptual framework. What they didn't actually appreciate was when the authors wrote about it in 2006, they said that it is never expected that one organization will practice all the elements in the conceptual framework. So if you're just citing that we're going to do it, you've got it wrong. And so only 10 actually tried to implement the framework, and only 1 used a knowledge broker to try and move between stages of the cycle. So please don't cite the co-produced pathway to impact as your impact pathway. It's your conceptual framework, and what you need to do is to be able to then reduce that pathway to practice. And that's where some of these tools come in. We don't have links to them, but there are tools available to help you with stakeholder engagement, and these aren't all our tools. There's some that are publicly available to help on the left-hand side with research planning, to help on dissemination, to help run events to facilitate uptake, and then to help tools to help assess the impact. And tools for stakeholder engagement. So don't feel you need to create your own tools. There's lots of tools that are out there. So this is another poll. It's a chance for me to stop talking and drink some water, and for you to say, what tools do you need? And only choose two, please. KT planning, stakeholder engagement, dissemination, workshop, or impact assessment, or other. So vote for each of you, vote twice. Interesting. By a long shot, people really want to have tools for stakeholder engagement. Now, if you voted for stakeholder engagement, I invite you to enter into the chat box, what would a tool do? What kind of tool are you looking for that would help you in your stakeholder engagement? Or what's the gap that you have that you feel you need the help? Because this seems to be by far the most tool in demand. Melody is typing, thank you very much. And while Melody is typing, anyone else can feel free to type and just share. What is the gap that you have? So Melody, clear stakeholder mapping and how stakeholders can connect their work with each other as well. So you're really looking for, so stakeholder mapping is a precursor to that stakeholder engagement. And I think doing both of those is necessary to be able to help you inform the type of research that you do. And I'll give a quick opportunity for anyone else. Thank you, Samantha, for typing. We'll see what Samantha has to say. I hope you find these polls and this opportunity to contribute throughout to be an engaging way of doing a webinar. Samantha, how to authentically engage community members or partners. I love, Samantha, that you used the word authentically. I made this point at a conference last week. I was giving a keynote, and much of the training that we do is focused on the academy. Well, how are we supposed to, and absolutely that training is mostly open to anyone, but how can an educator who's in the classroom every day and after class doing extracurricular activities and then goes home and has to be marking in the evening and has to be a mom and she's got elder care, how can she do our training? And part of authenticity is not only balancing power between academic and non-academic partners, but one of the ways we balance that power is by giving training and building capacity of our partners to be able to engage in this research. And Linda, better ways to maintain relationships rather than just popping in and out. Oh, I love that too. We had the CEO of a large nonprofit organization in our community, and he said you should do no drive-by partnering. You don't pop in and you don't pop out. And Kirsten said how to effectively engage stakeholders in defining scope and focus of research. So thank you for that. And Francesca, establishing partnerships with different stakeholders. And a big part of that partnership is understanding who they are, what their needs are, and coming together. It's important in the early days of my work, and I've been doing this for 12 years. Well, I've been doing commercialization much longer than that, but working in non-commercial research. And that we have to, one thing we have to do is it's not about I have in the academy, we have knowledge and you have, you don't. It's about finding complementary resources. Okay, so, complementary expertise. It's not about that I have something and you don't. And so I work with researchers and partners who can come together on an equal footing. Okay, if we could close that poll and we shall move on. Okay, so here's my secret sauce about writing an impact strategy in a grant application. Whether your impact strategy is health-related and you call it KT, it's social sciences and you call it knowledge mobilization, this even works for commercialization. I say that an impact strategy has to have 5 elements. You have to articulate who are your partners. And within your partners, you need to understand who are your stakeholders that you're engaging. Who are the receptors, the audiences that you're going to send things to and disseminate to, and who are your co-production partners? So everyone's a stakeholder, and your co-production partners are receptors. Your co-production partners are along with you for the ride, and the receptors are the end-of-grant dissemination receptors. And so identify who are your 1A, B, and C, and then what are the goals of the activities. Once you've identified your partners and done your stakeholder engagement, you mutually co-produce the goals of the project. And then what are the activities you're going to do with your partners? With your co-producing partners, you're going to go do co-produced research. With your receptors, you're going to do dissemination to academic and to non-academic receptors. And then with your with those receptors and also other stakeholders, you're going to do facilitated uptake. And then the fourth one is impact assessment. What are you going to measure and when? And do you have access to those data? And then what's the budget you're going to do? And so I'm going to link this back. If you remember partners, goals, activities, and impact, this lines up with the co-produced pathway to impact. Who are your stakeholders at the bottom, your 1A? Who are your co-production partners, which is your research partners? Who are your dissemination audiences and your uptake workshops? The spanner on the left is your goals as you're planning, and the spanner on the right is your impact assessment. So the impact, your classic impact pathway to me is derived, or sorry, your impact strategy is derived from the impact pathway. So I say if you have one page for your impact path strategy, you write 4 paragraphs. One on partners, one on goals, one on activities, one on assessment. And you can put other information in the budget. If you're working on a multi-million-dollar application and maybe you've got 4 pages, you write 1 page on each of these. And so through doing that, we've now, over the last 12 years, helped bring in $68 million of engaged research funding into York University. Not just because they have a kick-ass impact strategy, but we like to think that we're able to support that. Christina has written, academics and researchers have a very different set of needs to keep their jobs and be considered successful. How to make the academy and funders more flexible to see common needs and pathways. And that's, I'd love to spend an hour on that with you, Christina, and I think, and anyone who's got some suggestions, but one of the things that helps me about how I'm thinking about how to make the academy and funders more flexible is it's about being present in each other's spaces. I was asked last week when I was doing my workshop, someone told me about, he gave me his case and he said, what do I think? And I said, I'm the wrong person to tell you. What I can say is, rather than expecting people to come to you, you need to go to them. So you need to be active in the social media channels of your partners. If they're doing conferences, you show up at their conferences, and you just make yourself open to working differently. Okay, so now that's the how. Now we're going to move through the what and then the who. So the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, if we've got anyone from the UK or possibly Europe on the line, you will certainly have heard of the Research Excellence Framework. Every university in the UK is assessed, and billions of pounds, British pounds, is driven to funding universities based in part on their ability to articulate the impact of their research. And in the 2014 impact assessment, there were 150 universities with over 42,000 academic staff who talked about 191,000 research outputs, and these are the numbers that kill me. There were 6,975 impact case studies, and 3,709 unique pathways to impact. So just think about that there is almost no 2 ways to get to impact. And this is why when I said the co-produced pathway to impact is not your impact pathway, it's your conceptual framework. Your impact pathway is going to be unique, as these numbers show. 6,975 impact case studies, 3,709 unique ways to get there. And so every time I start with a faculty member, there's no cookie cutter. I use the same tools, but we go through the same process to get a very different pathway. Australia, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Hong Kong are all going in this direction, or have gone in this direction. So far in Canada and the US, we are not being driven by assessment, but we're creating impact because it's the right thing to do. It's aligned with our mission rather than an assessment. So, how do you collect the evidence of impact? This is work that we've done at York University in supporting the Ontario Collaborative Response to Family Violence and also within Kids Brain Health Network. We've worked off the Research Excellence Framework, and it's not a perfect framework at all, and we've made some significant changes to it that I won't go into here, but we piloted a tool on 2 cases from Kids Brain Health Network and 1 from the Ontario Collaborative Response to Family Violence. And this is a tool that takes the UK ref impact case study template, and we've added questions derived from contribution analysis. So what we've now got is a tool through the questions. It's a semi-structured survey tool that allows us to consistently collect the evidence of impact by interviewing researchers and non-academic partners. Part of the trouble with a lot of impact assessment is it works at the end of the grant. Your funder asks you to fill out a questionnaire. It works at the end of the grant, and it's asking the researcher. Well, at the end of the grant, the impact hasn't happened, and the researcher isn't the one who's creating the impact. So it's important that in a unit like my Knowledge Mobilization unit, that after, and the family violence example was a collaborative we put together in 2012, it was 2017 that they came to us, told us about the success they had, and we used this tool to be able to capture the evidence of that impact. So it's important that we have to, we can use this tool retrospectively, but one thing that I'm thinking about, because the questions are logic model questions, starting from what were the inputs and the starting conditions, what did you believe when you started this work, what type of training did you need, what were the activities that you did, what changed in your awareness and beliefs, based on what you changed, what did you do with that, and then what was the ultimate impact. So we should be able, I think, to be able to maybe use the first 2 questions this year on a new project. And then next year we go back to them, we say, well, last year you said 1 and 2, now maybe we can ask 3. And use this tool prospectively over time to monitor not just impact, because not everything gets to impact, but measure or collect the evidence of engagement as well. So this is a work in progress that we are just piloting at this time. It's now gone out to the members of the Research Impact Canada network. So I've talked about how and I've talked about what, and so the question comes to be, who are the people that does this work? Who are the people that do this work? This is a cute video. The guy on the left is Travis Steinhardt. He is a knowledge broker at Gambling Research Exchange, Ontario. And he's made this little video because he stresses out every time he goes to a party and someone says, so what do you do? And he says, I'm a knowledge broker. And they say, what is that? And this is a quick little video that we're not going to show right now, but Travis walks through all the things that he does. And he talks about his stakeholder engagement, how he has to identify common goals, he has to bring stakeholders to consensus and work on organizational change. He's got to develop relationships, but he also runs events. And these events are capacity building. And he's talking about the courses he runs and the seminars that he does and the workshops. And also it's about the evidence, he says, that he has to do environmental scans, quality appraisals, evidence synthesis, and he has to adapt the evidence to the local context. And finally, he says he does evaluation, rigorous evaluation that's looking to sustain long-term impact. So these are just the many things that Travis does in his day. And when you see it like that, you're going, oh my God. Do I really do all that? Because I often think that what I do isn't rocket science until someone says a list of things like that, and then it feels a lot like rocket science. So I encourage you to take a look at that video when you are able to download the slides. And so what we did, and the link to this article is in the red bar, is we synthesized a KT competency set. We synthesized 4 KT competency frameworks that had not yet been published. And we came to 80 competencies in these 11 categories here. And I mean, nothing here will surprise you, like change management, communication, evaluating impact. You look at G, managing legal issues and IP. We really tried to keep that out because it's not the work that we do, and there's a very strong culture of technology transfer and commercialization in the academy, and that's not the work that we tend to do, but it keeps not sneaking in, so we couldn't get it out. And then the last one, understanding, creating, and using KT tools. So these are the 80 competencies in these 11 categories. And what we did was we went out to practitioners with a survey. And we said, of these 80 competencies, do you practice it daily, weekly, monthly, rarely, or never? And based on that, we got these top 10. Competencies that research impact practitioners have demonstrated, and the one that everyone except one person said, I never practice internal communication, and I only hope that she or he is a single consultant because otherwise she'd end up talking to herself. Anyway, internal communication. So none of this is actually really shocking, I think. Internal communication, maintaining relationships, working in teams, multiple conversations, external communication, listening, organizing, facilitating, partner and relationship management, and reporting and presenting knowledge. So I encourage you to look at these and to think about how do you do this work, because that is the subject of the next poll. So if you could choose 3 on the next poll, tell the group, what are the top 3 things that the skills that you most use. Sorry, not you most use, the ones that you need the most, whether you use them or not, what are the ones that you need the most? And choose 3. Okay, I'm sure you're thinking that I do them all, and David's making me only choose 3, so how do I possibly choose these 3? Okay, a couple more still coming in. We'll get a little bit more because there are a number. Again, internal communication, developing relationships, working in teams, multiple conversations, external communication, active listening, organizing, facilitating, relationship management, and reporting and presenting of knowledge. So It's intriguing. I think we've got a lot of people spread out a lot of different ones. The working in teams, communities, and networks is the highest, 60%, so by far. But let me ask anyone who is looking at these, if there's something that's not on this list that is very important for you, please type that in the chat box now. Something that you do that, that our survey didn't capture as one of the top 10. Because the way we were thinking about these top 10 is this forms a competency core, a set of 10 core competencies that everyone should need, but then out of the remaining 70 of the 80 competency framework, you could pick and choose those that are unique to your role. So, for example, in my role, I also oversee the Technology Transfer and Commercialization and Entrepreneurship Unit of the university. So IP management is something that I practice on a weekly basis, right? But it's fairly niche. Christina has said managing conflict, very important. I couldn't tell you, Christina, if that was amongst our 80, but managing conflict, I guess as we work in teams, communities, and networks, the highest one on this list, then being able to manage that conflict as well. So thank you, Christina, for that contribution. And so again, with the WHO, where can you get this training? There's a couple of courses in Canada. The Certificate in Knowledge Mobilization is an online course that is recruiting right now for an intake. The Knowledge Translation Professional Certificate is a 5-day in-person intensive. It's all day for 5 days where you bring in your project and you end with your impact plan. They take about 15 or 16 people and run it. It's run 2 or 3 times per year. I have the pleasure of teaching in that course on the commercialization angle. And then, of course, I've included this conference, the online conference that AIR is sponsoring. So thank you very much to AIR for contributing to the capacity building of our practice. And so if you put these three together, the who, the what, and the how, this comes together in a framework that we're calling Research Impact Literacy. Again, the journal article is in the red bar. You'll be able to get that if you have access. It's unfortunately, not open access in Evidence and Policy, but you'll be able to get it from the Evidence and Policy or from your library. And it's the who, what, and how of impact literacy. And what we said is these are states of knowing. If you know how to create impacts, and if you know what impacts occur and how to assess those, and you know who the people are and what the skills you need to be able to do this work, you put those three together and you are impact literate. Missing any one of them in these spaces, you might have insufficient understanding of endpoints, you might have insufficient understanding of roles and skills to be able to do this work, therefore you will be, your practice will not be optimized, or you might have insufficient understanding of processes. So, and we came to this is my colleague Julie Bailey from the University of Lincoln in the UK, and I came to this because in Canada, we see primarily that we've got researchers who are functioning in the how space, creating impact strategies and grant applications to be able to support impact. In the UK, while they do that, they're driven by assessment. They're driven by the what of impact. And there's a much heavier focus institutionally on collecting the evidence of impact than there is on actually supporting impact to occur. And where there's a deficit in both countries is in really the who. How do we understand this? And so they understand the skills. So my question is, how do you go from a bit of impact literacy to a lot of impact literacy? And thank you. We have a hard time sort of saying what is a little and what is a lot. So for those of you who filled out the survey to be in advance of this, we talked about Padawan, Jedi, and Jedi Master of impact. So how do you go from being a Padawan to a Jedi Master? And you really need to build capacity. And so there's some tools that are available. And I'll just talk about this one that my colleague Julie, who I just mentioned, and I have published with Emerald Publishing. The link is, this is free to download from the Emerald Publishing website that is in the red bar there. They want you to give your address because it's a tool that is, I wouldn't say it's in pilot, but they're wanting to be able to follow up with people to see how it's being used. And this Impact Literacy Workbook is a planning tool. It's a tool that I sit with researchers and I walk them through all the stages of impact planning so that we understand what the problem is they're working on. We understand the impact that they hope to create. We understand what the indicators are and when are they going to get them, where are they going to get them from, and when are they going to get them. Who are the stakeholders and when do you engage them? We talk about the dissemination. Again, I come back to saying dissemination is necessary but is not sufficient. And then what are the skills you need to do this work? And then what are the challenges and who are the facilitators to do? Where do you go for help? And having worked through this entire workbook, at the end you get something that looks like this canvas. That is, this canvas is where you've done the work of the workbook, you transfer the information to this canvas. This is not your impact plan, but this is the raw material which can help you develop your impact strategy for your grant application, if that's what you're working on. So this is a systematic way of walking people through all the elements to think about impact, and then building out this canvas at the end, and then supporting them as they write their impact strategies. So I am going to end there, and to thank you for your attention at this time. We've got a bunch of time left for questions, and I encourage you to type your questions in the comment box, and we will address them as they come.
Well, thank you very much, David. That was great. That was really an excellent presentation. I can't believe how much material you covered in less than an hour. That was awesome. And you gave us a lot of resources that we can follow up with as well. So I'm hoping that we'll be getting some more questions from the audience. I do have a couple that came through that we can share. Can you talk a little bit more about the principles of co-production? Maybe what are some of the important pieces and parts of that?
Right, thank you. I'm going to go back to what one of the comments said about authentic partnerships. This is not about supply and demand. It's about recognizing that academic and research evidence is only one type of knowledge that goes into creating impacts. That we need to be able to hold up the knowledge of the expertise of lived experience, the expertise of policy, or the expertise of industry on an equal footing with academic expertise. Because when you combine different ways of knowing and different types of expertise in an authentic and a fashion that allows you to balance power, traditional unbalanced power, then that's where co-production works well. And one of the ways that you do this is by, as I mentioned previously, if you're in an academic setting, become active in the non-academic spaces. So follow the Twitter accounts and go on the Facebook pages of people and organizations who you're interested in engaging with. It's about going to their conferences or to their meetings and being open and available. And then when you do have an opportunity to engage, that you do it from one of a mutual respect. And it's not that you, and I always say to my researchers, you don't know it all. Right? And if you're not, if my researcher is not interested in understanding and collaborating with people who know just as much, but in a different way, then I don't put that person up for a partnership. Right? I only find the researchers who are interested and acknowledge that they only have part of the equation. The other way that we've seen to balance, there's two ways I'll talk about seen to balance in co-production, is one about sharing resources. We are really good in the university at holding on to money. And we spend money on things that we want to spend it on. And that's often in Canada because unless you construct your budget and your co-applicants correctly, you actually are not able to send money to a non-academic organization. But if you include your partner not as a partner on the grant forms, but as a co-applicant, and it means you're going to have to do their CV for them, then as a co-applicant, you're going to be able to send the money. And we did this with the United Way of York Region. We co-authored a grant application for $93,000. It came to the university and I sent $75,000 to them. They hired the primary worker off the grant. They were the ones that did the lion's share of the work. So it's a way of sharing resources. And the third thing I'll talk about has escaped me right now. So I will come back to that when I think about the third thing about sharing resources and sharing power. But those are two ways I would think of being able to start a collaboration, is focus on the authenticity of the partnership. And I guess the third thing would be knowing what they want, what the non-academic partner feels is valuable. All of this, I need to preface, and not just preface, but underline that this does not deny the importance of fundamental and basic and inquiry-driven research. We need to have that foundation in the academy. This type of work of impact should not privilege applied research over basic research in any way. It's just when the research has a life beyond the academy in a way that maybe cosmology or basic maths doesn't. And when the researcher is positively predisposed to working with a partner and where that partner has the capacity, then those three come together as an opportunity for collaboration.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that response. Kind of following up, we have a question. Do you have can you identify some strategies to initiate stakeholder engagement? That's kind of a big question, too.
I think I just talked a little bit about this by going and becoming active in their space. I think the most important characteristic to start stakeholder engagement is authenticity. I mentioned about authentic partnerships, but it's about being open to what your partners need you to do as well as being open to what you need to do. And it doesn't mean you have to, if you don't want to work on what they want to work on, then you don't need to start that partnership. It doesn't mean that you don't have to change what you do. It means that you don't work with that partner. But when you found that partner that is interested in the same things you're interested in, that's where it can go move forward to explore that partnership. And I would say again that being active in their spaces, being open and being authentic to their interests is one strategy. One way that I've done this is by holding a community forum. So one thing that we've done is we've gone to our community partners and we said, what's important to you this month? And one of the first ones they did was youth mental health. And so the community partners, and we've got deep roots with our local municipality and our United Way, and so it was their job to bring some mental health agencies into the room. It was our job to bring researchers into the room. We held a presentation, one presentation by an academic, one presentation by a non-academic. That's a way of creating parity. The academics are the ones used to talking, but you get them to shut up for a little bit and listen to the expertise of practice and of community and of policy. But it's the go around the room that is the most important thing. Once those presentations have been made, people start to chat. And my measure of success from a community forum like that is that there's a couple of people standing in the corner an hour after you've shut down their sessions and they're still chatting. I go up to them and say, you look like you're having a good conversation. How can I help? And so it's, again, a way of being active and open in their spaces and absolutely saying what's important to you, but listening what's important to them.
Great. Thank you so much. Here's another question. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the role and the work of a knowledge broker and a professional communicator?
We wrote a paper on that. So if you look up Barwick, B-A-R-W-I-C-K, Barwick and Phipps, my last name, so Melanie Barwick, let me type that in. Barwick and Phipps, and the journal is Scholarly Research and Communications. So if you look us up on Scholarly Research and Communication, SRC, I've got that wrong, I'll look it up. But those are three of the 4 words of the title of the journal. A couple of years ago, we were holding an event on knowledge brokering, and a health communicator raised her hand and said, you guys, we've been doing this for 30 years, you just call it something different. And Melanie Barwick came back and go, oh no, communications is a skill we practice, but we know we're not professional communicators. We are not science communicators. The type of material we work on is different. The way we engage stakeholders is different. This ended up being an argument in the room that my colleague Michael Johnny had to moderate, and I thought it would be interesting to put this on LinkedIn, and so we did, and we got 44 contributions from 20 contributors. And because it's LinkedIn, you could see who someone was. And there is a split between science communicators, health communicators, and knowledge brokers or knowledge mobilizers. And so we used that stream as the evidence or the data to write a paper that it's unpacking the similarities and differences of communications and knowledge translation is the name of the article. And really where we found is it's like a Venn diagram with 2 circles. There is research-based knowledge mobilization where you're really looking at the research evidence on one hand, and on the far side, diametrically opposed is strategic and institutional communications, where they're mainly, think of your university's research communications department, or your university's communications department that only broadcasts and is interested in brand control. What happens in the middle is sometimes you have an institutional knowledge broker service like mine that is focusing on evidence, but we're not in a specific research field. And sometimes you've got communicators in a specific research field, and I use something like the David Suzuki Foundation, which is in sustainability and climate change. And the communicator in the David Suzuki Foundation is very interested in policy change. And so I think there's differences on either side, and there's similarities. So I encourage you to get that article, Scholarly and Research Communications is the title of the journal.
Got it. Okay, thank you very much. So are there some pitfalls in uptake of information that may not be what you had planned or hoped for? I mean, like you may have an idea of this is how we think this information will be useful, but what if people take it up and use it in a different way? Is that problematic, or is that something that you would expect?
So I have had a couple of instances on the relationships we've put together where we have to help people break up in a healthy fashion. So there, it's a hard thing because the evidence should be neutral. But as people, we put values on that evidence. And researchers are not value-free. We hope the evidence is value-free, but researchers are not value-free, nor are the people who are implementing value-free. So I think that we've seen lots of examples of, and I think specifically to vaccine research, where evidence has been taken and used in ways that it was never intended to be used by the researchers. And I think in that case, I think in that case, so if we are having authentic partnerships with the people who are going to be using our research evidence, then you've got trust within that relationship. So I would say that one way of minimizing the misuse of research evidence is by doing that in collaboration with authentic partnerships. If you publish a paper and someone takes that up and they're not a partner with you, but they just take that up and do something with it, your only recourse really is to engage in the debate and then to say, no, that's not what the evidence says. But you can't, once your evidence is out there, you can't really stop people using it. So I would encourage you to think that by doing integrated knowledge translation, we have a greater chance that the people who are going to be using the evidence are co-creating it with us, and therefore you've built a space of trust. Because we've seen how evidence can be, we've got this with vaccines, we've got this with climate change, right? And whether the evidence is used or is just ignored is another situation where researchers and those who produce evidence can get frustrated because your evidence that you're doing is just ignored. I mean, those end up being, again, part of attribution. A policy decision, research evidence is only one thing that influences a policy decision. And the Deputy Minister of Education in the province of Ontario said to me many years ago, David, remember that evidence doesn't vote. And so that recognizing the political cycle, the intentions of voters, the flavor of the month or of the party in power will interpret evidence differently. So I think if you are an evidence producer, if you're an academic researcher, I think what you can do is just make sure that your evidence is rigorous, that it's been peer-reviewed, that it's been partnered appropriately, and that you are actively engaging that with people who you trust to be able to do something with your evidence.
Well, this question kind of follows right along. Can you talk about some strategies to really know when your information or evidence is ready to share?
My first answer is no, I don't have any strategies for that. I would say that your evidence, so there's two things about is your evidence ready to be shared. I think you have to be confident that your evidence is robust. And so whatever measure of your evidence, if you're an academic researcher, that is usually peer review, that it has met the international standards of peer review. And if you're an evidence producer in something like an indigenous community, that your peers may not be academic peers, but there's other ways of reviewing evidence. So I think first you want to ensure that your evidence is robust. And secondly, though, I would say that, again, if you're working in collaboration, your partners are going to call bullshit on you. Oh, can I say bullshit? I just did it twice. Anyway, your partners are going to call bullshit on you pretty quickly if they don't think your evidence is ready to be shared. If they don't feel that their needs are being met by the evidence use. So I would say being confident that your evidence is robust, but then also understanding the I'll say market for your evidence and how that can be and how that informs what you think of your evidence, the readiness for use.
Okay, it's really clear that these partnerships are super important from the very beginning all the way through the end. And next question is, who should be involved in the evaluation of the KT activities and the KT impact? And I guess some thoughts about identifying the important players that will help out in that evaluation process.
So that's a really good point. I'm going to flip back to our Coproduced pathway to impact. Are the slides still up on the screen? So the question is how, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, who should be involved in the evaluation of the KT activities and KT impact? So like how would you identify who the important players might be in participating in the evaluation process?
Right. So I think I'm going to use the same answer as how do you do stakeholder engagement, because having done stakeholder mapping and identified the key partners who are going to be your co-production partners, I would say that they are also the people who are going to be able to help you evaluate. That your evaluation partners should not be different than your co-production partners. And so because critically, as I said, it's the partners who are making the impact. They're delivering the services, developing the policies, or producing the products. And so you need to collect the data from them, from the ones who are actually doing that work. So, so by planning that data collection in at the front end and engaging those stakeholders at the beginning, you're in a position where you know the partners who will be able to provide you the evidence of the impact because they're the ones who are actually doing it. So it comes back to good stakeholder engagement at the front end.
Right. I can really see how it's critical throughout the entire process. Another question here. So much of the KT and mobilization practices and frameworks have been developed in Canada. Do you see any problems with like trying to adapt or apply these models in other contexts, for example, the U.S. and elsewhere?
It's a good question. So a lot of the scholarship has come out of the Canada. It's true, but there's a lot of practice around the world. And in the U.S., especially if you're in a STEM discipline, but not exclusively, there's a group called the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, or NABI, and they are broaderimpacts.net. Just type that in, broaderimpacts.net. This is a network that is led by the University of Missouri, and they've been focusing up till now on impacts, broader impacts than NSF grants. But they're very much diversifying beyond NSF grants and looking at impacts beyond the academy, and they're diversifying beyond science communications as being a primary way of creating impacts for STEM. So the Research Impact Canada, the Canadian network, is collaborating with NABI to do some of this exchange. And I think we've got, and we're interested in learning from the deep practice base that NABI has. Certainly, a lot of in Canada, our impact assessment tool is derived exclusively from the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. They don't have necessarily the same theoretical underpinnings as the way we've adapted it, but we couldn't have done our impact work without having been inspired and guided by the positives and negatives of the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. So there is a growing international connection around this. If you are in research grant administration or you're in grants, there's a group called, each country, many countries in the world have a research management society, and they come together in an international organization, and I have just been asked to co-chair a committee of impact practitioners that includes Canada, the UK, Belgium, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Ghana, and Japan. And so we're starting, it's early days, whoever asked the question about can these models be transferred. It's early days to be actually looking at, to answer that question, but I absolutely think that the principles of stakeholder engagement will transcend countries. How you do that stakeholder engagement will be country specific, probably even more context specific than just at the country level. How you build capacity is different in Ghana than it's going to be in Argentina. We did a paper on looking at some of the essential building blocks of research impact supports, was comparing practices in Canada, Ghana, Argentina, and Vanuatu, and we found that we had 5 things the same. I'm going to try and remember them. It's build capacity, It's work on peer supports. It's understand the social, cultural, political context of your partners. It is work, and those are 3 out of the 5. I can't remember the other 2. So I do think that there are things that transcend the transborder contexts, and that these pathways will be able to be applied certainly in developed countries, industrialized nations like Canada and the U.S., but we're also seeing lots of efforts in developing countries as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm hoping we're going to get a couple more questions or maybe some discussion going with the audience. But in the meantime, I do want to thank you again for a great presentation. I think you've covered so many things so well that maybe you answered questions that people didn't even know they had, so they're not bringing up more questions now. I guess I have a question of my own, and I know one of the problems for really identifying impact is the length of time that it takes for research to really be, I guess, fully vetted, as you were talking about, peer-reviewed, and then to be able to be shared. And then how long does it take to really be able to measure impact? And I'm not sure that there's really a timeline for this or that there even could be a timeline. But I do know that the time from doing research to measuring that impact can be problematic. So I don't know if there's any ideas you might have or thoughts about how to speed up this process, or is that something that we shouldn't even consider, just it takes the time that it needs?
No, I think we can consider speeding it up. I remember seeing a few slides from a presentation from Melanie Barwick at the Hospital for Sick Children, and citing the case of scurvy in the 1700s. And many captains of ships knew that if you took citrus fruits on your journey, that you avoided scurvy. But that took a couple hundred years to actually be implemented in the Royal Navy or something like that. I'm making that up. So the time from evidence to implementation in a system-wide setting was a couple hundred years. I've read that the time for health research to be implemented into health practice today is 17 years. And I think, and I don't know where that comes from, but I believe that knowledge translation is a way of speeding up that process. And so I do think we need to not be complacent to say, well, it's 17 years, so it's 17 years. I think we can, that's from traditional research to traditional non-engaged research to its uptake and implementation. But if we employ these KT methods, which include stakeholder engagement, I do believe that we're going to be able to speed up that time frame. But that's going to require some study. That's a research study in itself, to be able to look at what is the impact of all of this effort on KT. Has it actually made a difference? And I don't know of any articles or research that has asked that question. And I'd be very interested if anyone in the audience knows of anything that they're able to point to, because I think that's a really important question. Is what we do making any difference whatsoever? Because, gosh, we do a lot of it.
Very true, very true. So I hope that the audience will pipe up a little bit. We're almost out of time, but we do have several minutes left. And I'd like to see if we can get a little bit more input from the audience before we wrap up. I see we've got a question here about the slides, that they don't seem to be screen reader accessible, which they should be. So if that's a problem, that's something that we'll have to follow up on after the fact, apparently. So if we don't have any more comments from the audience, do you have anything you'd like to wrap up with, David, as some last thoughts to send us off today?
I guess the only thing, because I did see a couple of questions of, hey, can we contact you? And I'm just going to write in our Research Impact Canada website, because we've got some resources there. That's in the link I just put in the chat box. There's a lot of resources there. There's contact information for folks. And I would say, you know, I'm always happy to engage. I think the Twitter handle, there's on the slide on the screen now, @ResearchImpact. So there's ways to get in touch. I'm not the only person who does this in Canada or in the States or in the world. So let me know if you're interested, and I might be able to find someone closer to home for you to be able to continue these discussions.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can roll us down to the end of our slides here. Let's see, next one. Okay, so this is our final slide giving contact information for the Center on KTDRR. And of course, we're very happy to share any information that, if questions from people, we can send them to you, David, and I know you'd be happy to get back to them. So I want to thank you again for taking time today to give us this great overview of knowledge translation and sharing the framework that you've worked on so long, and it seems like you've covered so many really important aspects there for helping us to move information to have greater impact. I want to thank everyone for participating this afternoon, and we hope you'll take a few minutes to give us some feedback about the webcast by filling out the brief evaluation, and Shoshana has just posted the link there in the chat box. We'll also be sending out an email with the evaluation link to everyone who is registered. I also want to thank the AIR staff who help with planning and logistics, and of course we want to thank NIDILRR for their support to offer these webcasts and other events. And before we end today, we also want to invite you to register for, if you have not already, to attend our 2018 online KT conference coming up next week on the afternoons of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, November 5, 7, and 9, if you are in North America, where the theme will be engaging ways to engage stakeholders. Please visit our website at www.ktdrr.org for more details. And thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you.